Growing fast is great, but growing sustainably is even better. And a cornerstone of sustainable growth is being able to retain and grow revenue from your existing customer base. To achieve this, monthly recurring revenue, MRR, alone is not a great KPI. So here's why you should already be using net revenue retention, or START, when it makes sense to do so, more on that later, as the new benchmark for your SaaS business. First things first, what is NRR? Net revenue retention is a revenue metric that measures the recurring revenue generated from existing customers over a set period of time. It is often also referred to as net dollar retention, or NDR. And in short, net revenue retention includes upgrades, downgrades, and customer churn to indicate business growth potential from the current customer base. Net revenue retention does not include new customers. Yes, excluding new customers might be somewhat unconventional, especially if NRR is new to you. However, there are good reasons and evidence to back up why NRR matters. So, why is net revenue retention important to recurring revenue businesses? Simply put, NRR is a crucial metric for subscription companies looking to assess the sustainability of their business. And as we know, sustainable growth in SaaS relies on retaining existing customers and growing their accounts with you. Monthly recurring revenue alone is obviously not a sufficient metric for that. So for starters, NRR measures more than just growth. New founders love to chase growth at all costs, but this metric actually tells you a lot more about a company than looking at high-level metrics like monthly recurring revenue. Why? Well, put it this way. A low NRR would indicate that the company is struggling to retain customers, doesn't have a sticky product, and lacks customer engagement. MRR, on the other hand, can hide this when growth is used as sticky tape to fix a leaky bucket. But if you operate this way, you'll never achieve truly sustainable growth. Before we wrap up this section, let's finish off with a friendly reminder. Growth at all costs was never a good mindset to begin with. Now, let's take a look at NRR rates of SaaS companies with the most successful IPOs in history. Although going public might not be a goal you're even working towards for your company, it's still worth taking a look at the NRR rates of some of the most successful IPOs in SaaS, because there is something you can learn from companies that have gone public. Starting off with Snowflake, which reported an NRR rate of approximately 158% at the time of its IPO in various financial documents and IPO-related documentation. Sources such as CNBC and Bloomberg also covered these figures in their IPO reporting. Next, we have Zoom, the company we all know thanks to 2020. Zoom's NRR was healthily sitting around 130 to 140% around the time of their IPO. This was, of course, part of their IPO filings, as well as subsequent earnings reports, and financial news outlets like the Wall Street Journal and Reuters both reported these figures. Moving on to DocuSign, a company you've likely seen people question why they need 7,800 some employees to run an e-signature and contract management software company. Nonetheless, we can question that all we want, but DocuSign's NRR rate was reported to be above 120% in its S1 filing. And last but certainly not least, for these examples, we have HubSpot, the CRM we all know and many I know dread using. Jokes aside, I fortunately am not the person entering data into the CRMs various companies we work with use, so I can't comment on that part of HubSpot. What I can comment on is that HubSpot's NRR rate, being in the range of 100% to 120%, was detailed in its S1 filing, and again reflected in financial reports and analysis from sources like TechCrunch and the Financial Times. Alright, so by now, considering you're still here, I think it's safe to say you know the importance of net revenue retention, considering I've driven that point home as much as is humanly possible. So let's move on to the fun part. How do we calculate net revenue retention? The good news is the net revenue retention formula is pretty simple. First, you add up your starting MRR and expansion MRR. Then you add up your contraction MRR and churn MRR. Now subtract the second figure from the first, meaning subtract the sum of contraction MRR and churn MRR from the sum of starting and expansion MRR. Then divide this figure by your starting MRR. And last but not least, multiply this figure by 100. Your result is your net revenue retention rate. To clarify each of these metrics, in case you're unfamiliar with any of them, starting MRR is the monthly recurring revenue from the previous month. Expansion MRR is the total new revenue that was generated from existing customers through upgrades, upsells, and so on. Contraction MRR is the total revenue lost from existing customers from downgrades. And churn MRR is the total revenue lost from customers churning and no longer using your product. This may be obvious, but I feel as though it does need to be said because I've seen other people try to do these calculations. Whatever period you use for your calculations, Obviously, make sure that it is consistent across all of the individual metrics you use as inputs in the formula. So, what is a good net revenue retention rate? Now that you know how to calculate your NRR and have likely just plugged in the figures for your business into the formula we've covered, it's safe to assume you'll be wondering whether you have a good net revenue retention rate. The simple answer is that as long as you're above 100%, you're in a pretty good position. Some industry benchmarks qualify this further and say that a good position is 109%. Obviously, the higher the better, so you want to set realistic goals, but also set goals that encourage you and your team to frequently question why your NRR is what it is, and whether you can do anything to raise it even further. And I'd also add 2 additional rules of thumb that you may find useful. An NRR rate of above 120% is indicative of a very healthy business. For anyone under 100%, you should focus on why customers are churning and/or contracting, rather than going all in on finding new customers, as this is ultimately meaningless. Once you tap out on growth, if you still have an NRR of under 100%, you'll end up in a very bad position. Don't put this off chasing the next marketing strategy with the promise of quick revenue. As a quick aside, a question I sometimes get is whether there's a notable difference between net revenue retention and gross revenue retention. So gross revenue retention measures the total revenue retained from existing customers over a given period, excluding any increases, so expansion revenue, or decreases, so contraction revenue. What this really means is it is a simplified version of NRR that uses the formula total revenue minus churn over total revenue. As a result, gross revenue retention can't exceed 100% because it doesn't consider the revenue growth driven by existing users of your product. We almost always gain more from focusing on NRR and investigating what makes a company's net revenue retention rate a certain value. This is simply because GRR mainly helps you understand income retention, but there are other KPIs that already indicate this anyway. Moving on, another unrelated insight that I think is worth mentioning is that SaaS Capital's 2023 retention benchmark report finds that A, the median NRR across SaaS companies is 102%, but also notably that higher ACVs, annual contract values, generally correlate with better retention rates. For example, SaaS companies with ACVs above 250,000 tended to see median NRR rates of around 110%, while companies with ACVs lower than 12,000 saw NRR rates closer to 100%. In my opinion, what this data highlights is the importance of targeting higher value clients, as they tend to yield higher NRR as a result of increased stickiness and upsell potential. Overall, these benchmarks show that achieving an NRR of over 120% indicates an extremely healthy business with strong growth and a competitive edge. Looking for input from a team that's worked with category-leading companies, possibly just like yours? Well, we're here and always happy to help. Please feel free to land in my inbox anytime. I'm reachable at alex@scalemath.com. And if you enjoyed this as much as I did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.